Welcome to the Greater Irvine Chamber Business Insights podcast series, where we address challenges and ideas for early stage and entrepreneurial business leaders. Your host today is Dave Coffaro, President and CEO of the Greater Irvine Chamber.
Well, hello, folks, and welcome to the Greater Irvine Chamber Business Insights podcast. I'm Dave Coffaro. I'm your host. And this episode is the first in a new series that we're calling the Innovator's Journey. So in this series, we're going to speak to founders, to innovators, to people that are building something to address, in many cases, age-old issues, but in new ways. And so they'll share their stories, their challenges, and what's next in their journey. In today's episode, our guest is Peman Montazemi, and he is the founder and CEO of Finally Quiet. I'm so excited to have you with us. You've shared your story with me, and now is a chance to share it with others, Peman. So for starters, would you share a little bit about your professional background and what you did prior to starting Finally Quiet?
Good day, Dave, and thank you so much for having me on the show. So I'm a medical device executive with over 24 years of experience. And what I did prior to that, I've been in various classifications of medical devices, from the smaller ones that are outside of the body all the way to implants, and including cochlear implants, total knee replacements, and whatnot. I've been the first phase of my career on the corporate side, so Fortune 500 companies, very, very fortunate to be there. And whereas maybe the second half of my career, I've been part of more startups, small to mid-sized, companies. And just to tell you a little bit of some of the results, so with the precious help of my previous companies and also the previous teams that I had the privilege of leading, I have commercialized over 10 medical devices of medium to high complexities, and those take usually an entire village to release over a very long periods of time. And I've also helped raise close to $100 million, for other startups where I was not the CEO, but I was supporting those specific raises. And I've been also very fortunate to be a part of 4 companies that exited between $10 million and $2 billion, part of those mergers and acquisitions. And so that's prior to Finally Quiet, which inspired me, of course, to start, my own startup.
That's amazing. And what a great story, which explains with all that you've got going on and all you've done, why I get emails from you at 1:30 in the morning, because you don't sleep. So I get that. But so let's talk a little bit about your company. And every great innovation begins with an idea. What was the defining moment that led you to start Finally Quiet and take this kind of age-old problem in dentistry and do something different?
Sure. So it's really roughly about 11 and a half years ago. So my wife is a dentist. And at the time we were carpooling, and then she enters the car, and I was picking her up, from the clinic after work. And then she enters the car and she abruptly basically turns off the radio. And I asked her, did you have a bad day? Did you get into a fight with a colleague, a difficult patient? You never know what can happen, And she said, well, you know what? I think I have the beginning of tinnitus, which is ear ringing, and all this sound and the noise generated by the instruments, and of course the constant dump from patients who come in very anxious. The minute I start the drill, I start the suction, they become anxious, so all that dump, I have to absorb that, and I get a huge headache on top of this specific condition. And right there, since I was very aware of the audio technology and active noise canceling headphones at the time and whatnot, I knew that they cannot basically cancel high frequencies, and that's the aha moment happened there. And I called a very good friend of mine, Dr. Massimo Mitolo, who is a world-renowned, engineer and expert in the protection in the work environment. And guess what? A month later, we filed for our first patent on a high-frequency, noise canceling and abatement or reduction system for dentistry specifically. And we obtained that specific first patent in March of 2017 later.
So I guess you owe this all to your wife for letting you know that there was a problem and that you could solve it. You've shared a little bit about all the startups and early stage companies you've been involved with. And one of the common obstacles is, fundraising. There's no question fundraising is important, but there's other things too. Team building, market adoption. Those are some of the biggest ones. what are some of the unexpected challenges that you've encountered, and how have you adapted in facing those new challenges?
Sure. So this is a 300 euro problem that we're trying to solve. And the fact is that um, good for us, there's not much awareness actually about hearing loss and patient anxiety. Although we all experience it, there's very little awareness. So that is both a challenge, but also an opportunity. The challenge piece is, of course, to talk to even doctors and patients and whatnot, and see how they gauge basically the specific problem. And when they think about it, they understand and said, yes, I know exactly what you're talking about, but we don't necessarily see a solution out there. How are you planning to solve it? So there's a lot of like a big educational piece that comes in, which is where I see the opportunity to approach dental schools and dental assistant schools and dental hygienist schools, and of course specialty schools, to create that. But on the other side of the spectrum, we speak with dentists who are retired, like 50, 60, 70 years old, the dentists. And guess what? Most of them are, if not all of them, are partially deaf. So that means that there's at least one ear is completely, uh, incapable of understanding high frequencies or hearing high frequencies, and some of them are wearing basically hearing aids, and then so they're basically living proof that there's a market for this type of product, but it's already too late. So how can we basically come back in time and prevent basically something like that? Because having knowledge of course, earmuffs and ear protection, but also cochlear implants, they'll never behave the same than your own ears. So why do we basically damage it? So that educational piece of it has been probably the biggest challenge to create awareness among the dental community, but also on the patient side, and at the same time use that as an opportunity to really turn that around to create an opportunity of creating awareness, and because then that reduces your competition.
It's so I go back to just the fundamentals of any business, which is know your client, know your customer. And the way you're describing it is you're speaking to something that's been around, you said 300 years at least, and people know it's there, but the education you're providing them on there is a solution, and finally Quiet has the solution. That's got to be really rewarding to you.
It is, and although it's been really going there, and we talk about the 11 and a half year journey is to stay with the problem. Like Einstein said, he's not necessarily smarter, but he just stays a lot longer with the problem. So we've been going at this problem for a very long time, knowing that it takes time to convince people, it takes time to educate people, and it takes time to create really awareness around that. And so that is the part that we have been extremely fortunate to be in.
Yeah, very interesting. So Orange County is a home to a thriving med tech and tech ecosystem. We're really fortunate. How has being based here influenced your company's development and your networking opportunities? Because I know you network a lot.
It's fantastic because Orange County has the highest concentration of medical devices globally. We're number one. So there's basically more than 400 startups and large corporations that are in the medtech space that are in less than 25 miles squared. And then so you can imagine the pool of talents that are here and how diverse their backgrounds are, from chemistry to biotech to medtech to in vitro diagnostics. It's very mixed, and you have software engineers, you have computer engineers, you have electrical engineers, and all of them are right here at the tip of our fingers. And then so therefore, for startups like us, we can have local offices, and that makes a huge difference, because if you're in the hardware world, you need to have your team pretty much co-located. Having a team that is, you receive a piece of the electronics at your house, and I'm doing the mechanics here. When you do integration between these pieces, it's extremely difficult not to have your team, all there, because it slows down your troubleshooting, and in case there are any errors or any mistakes or any bugs, in the system. So having access to this talent, and of course, I have 5 executive coaches, and so these 5 coaches are right here, and some of them come from for the communication industry, some of them come from the food industry, some of them very much come from medtech. and they're right here. So instead of meeting just like you and I would be meeting on a virtual call, I can go and grab coffee, I can go and grab lunch or dinner with them locally, and that really enhances the relationship, and also the sixth sense of having each other in the same space rather than being virtual. And then the last piece of that, of course, from an investment perspective, is always much better, to meet people, locally. And then so, of course, Orange County in Southern California has a lot of people who are, interested in always support, founders and support startups. So again, going back to the in-person meetings, it's just phenomenal to have access to people with so much knowledge, because one person never has the entire knowledge. So
Right, right. That's where the network comes into play. Can you talk a little bit more about the 5 executive coaches? Tell me a little bit about that. What's the story there, and how did that come about?
yeah, so it just tells you, how many weaknesses I have, right? So I'm always very, very, interested in my own weaknesses, and because you need to be aware of them, and then so you can consider them as mirrors. Some of them are really on the communication side, some of them, and of course that helps, with PR. It helps with, being in public and whatnot. I'm also a musician, by training, so therefore when it comes to performance, uh, being shy and on stage, etc., has never been a problem. But the fact is that the messaging of it is extremely important. You have a million thoughts, and of course, I have an engineering background, and we tend to be more on the geeky side. And then so when you talk to investors and when you talk others, etc., they're interested in the executive summary of things. And of course, it is very important to not only speak, eloquently and whatnot, but get to the point, straight to the point in very few sentences, because investors or other people don't have, the whole, time in the world. Um, so that's one aspect. The other aspects, of course, are technical. You can always have technical difficulties, talking about optics, people who are in lasers. I talk to them on a frequent basis to, expand my knowledge and continue to understand evolving technology for the needs of bettering humanity, and the care that we give. So it is our mission, just like doctors have classes they attend, they read journals and whatnot to maintain themselves with the latest and the greatest. A technologist has to always do that. So I have mentors on that end as well.
I'm so glad you brought this up, Peman, because the idea of a coach, I would actually argue it doesn't mean you have a weakness. It means you have another set of eyes and ears to help you look at things and bring out the best in you. And I think it's wonderful that you do that. I encourage any founder, any startup leader, any leader to consider a coach. And from my own career, I've had a coach for most of my career, multiple different coaches. But I think it gives you that ability to have a different perspective than you might otherwise have and see things different. And that's so rich. You don't always get that when you're starting a company because the people you work with may not be willing to tell you.
Right.
Coaches tend to be really candid. And so I really appreciate you bringing that up.
Yeah, and it's also a very humbling exercise. It's always important that, for me, important to keep my ego always in, and be very close to it and very in touch with it, and always keep it at a lower, so that, you let the rest of it, radiate.
So, as we talk about ego, something that can certainly challenge one's ego is funding. And funding is one of the biggest challenges I think that a lot of early stage startups have. It's also a top priority. You need the capital to further the mission. So, in today's environment, we've got a higher interest rate environment than we had a couple of years ago. That certainly changed the dynamics. And, there was a lot of competition for those kinds of resources. So, what strategies have you found to be effective or that didn't work? And what advice would you share with other founders, other early stage companies that are listening on how to work your way through funding?
Yeah. So uh, this is, I guess, the part of the conversation that is a lot more vulnerable, right? A lot of exposure to, personal information and things like that, which is very important that we are actually very open about that, and be very transparent. So my wife and I, we have twins. They're 3 years old. So you can imagine, as a founder, The operational cost of a household with nannies and things like that, etc., are very important. You're not just one person by yourself running a startup. Everything is interlinked, and so it is important that every decision that is made, of course, takes those in consideration. So during the times that we're raising funds, of course, right now we're close to 7%, or so sometimes exceeding 7%. Every time that you're above the 5% of US bonds, basically, investors have the option of course, putting their money into bonds or in a any kind of CD or safe. And what that does for them, it guarantees them a certain X numbers within 10 years, because that's guaranteed, and then the banks is backed by the federal government and whatnot. Every time that you be under 5, then that's where they have the choice to start investing in more high risk. And of course, we're in our case, at a seed round, and the seed round is still, pretty high risk when it comes to that. But of course, high risk, high reward. So in this specific environment, we had to change the strategy. First of all, number one, I'm consulting on the side, very, very small number of hours, to keep my operational costs going and whatnot. And that is always something that is good, because, again, it's a humbling exercise. You enter an environment that you're not necessarily familiar with. It sharpen and continue to sharpen your skills. And then number three, you're also contributing and helping others with your own lessons learned and experiences. So that's for the operational cost at home. On the outside of things, of course, we're running left and right, and having as many meetings as possible, because fundraising is really the timepiece that is the killer of any kind of startup. If you don't raise funds, rapidly, that's the end of the startup. So therefore, we have changed several strategies. Number one, I hired a chief commercial officer whose name is John Hollister, and we doubled down on fundraising and doubled down on the commercial operations. He's a phenomenal individual. So that's what I did for me, so that there are two people. So if some of us have small kids and whatnot, his kids, let's say, have already graduated and whatnot. And then so that helps me, so that if he needs to jump on a plane, he can go instead of I go. And then when I go, so that way we have doubled ourselves. And then so now we're going after double the number of contacts. And then the other thing we have done is that we have diversified the number of and the type of funding that we're going after. Not necessarily, let's say, VCs. Maybe some angels we have worked in the past are interested. VCs are a lot less, specifically for the stage we're in, but personal people who are just local investors, high net worth individuals, and it takes time to meet with them. So therefore, we have gone to them, and of course, family offices. We have changed that strategy, and since then, guess what? We have had a lot more traction, a lot more interest, because not necessarily VCs are at this stage, and given the current rates, etc., would invest in a high risk startup, just like ours.
It is all the above. It's all the things you mentioned, and looking at ways that you can fund your household as well as the business. And that is part of the innovators challenge is, and you said it very well, it's being creative, it's being humble, it's looking for all different ways to keep the wheels on, get other people to help you identify opportunities. And what you talked about before, it's the networking too, because you never know who you're going to run into, who's going to know someone who says, finally quiet is the place I need to invest, because I know that problem. I understand that problem, and I want to help solve that problem. One thing that goes along with that, though, is you were describing it, is for any entrepreneur, it can be a roller coaster. There are ups and downs. How do you stay motivated and focused when things get tough?
That's a very good question. And of course, there in the entrepreneurship, life, there are a lot more downs than there are ups. We see those highlights, in the, let's say, on LinkedIn or online or on this podcast or that podcast, or even, on the stock exchange and things like when people, companies go IPO, and great for them. But that moment is only one moment. And then so what I do in my mind is that I remember all the great things that happened in the past 11 and a half years, um, including the latest, extremely humbling, Innovator of the Year award, that granted by the Irvine, Greater Chamber of Commerce. But those moments, I replay them just like a film, and all those dark spots that are in the middle of it, there were challenges, and we worked some ways around. I try to not ignore them, use them as lessons learned. However, I don't play them part of that movie in my head. So when you talk about Finally Quiet is an hour and 30-minute movie, and it has only the best moments of it. And I play that in my mind every time that things become tough. And the second piece of that is that I also look of how to not just help dentistry with finally quiet, but how to position ourselves to be actually an AI driven communication system and interface for other verticals, including hospitals, including sports, including Department of Defense. And these are things that we're very seriously considering, because it is a platform technology that is speech driven with hearing and whatnot, and that creates another opportunity. And that's like my heart is flying when I think of that. So by creating these moments of the technology, and not just thinking, across one vertical, but really expanding on what is the potential of helping humanity. Am I going to just help dentistry, or are we going to really use that and as a platform technology to help others? Just that thought, makes me so excited and happy. And that's how I continue and keep going, because 11 and a half years, for God's sake, is a very long time.
It is, and you're a very positive person, and that shows and that helps you keep going. And so looking at the highlight reel and the good things rather than the challenges is a really positive way to do it. I would be curious though, because there's always setbacks. That's just the nature of business, and not to dwell on it, but can you point to a time when something didn't go the way you thought it was going to, and kind of whatever it was, and what you did to navigate your way through it and find your way out at the other side?
Yes, so I guess the biggest setback is right before COVID-19, and me not having my executive MBA. Going back to me being harsh on myself and looking at my weaknesses or lacks of knowledge or whatnot. I needed to become the person who's the right person to lead this company, not just technologically or technically, but also a person who can see 360 degrees. So the biggest setback, of course, with COVID and whatnot, was that at the same time we were extremely fortunate, to become pregnant in the middle of COVID, and which was a blessing, because we have been in the works for 4 or 5 years, and suddenly a miracle happens. And so that was extremely the most extreme I can think, as a case, of turnaround. That setback in COVID and everything dying, our units, we couldn't test them in clinics anymore. So I have these units, staying, in my garage. We can no longer collect, patient surveys. You would think is a kiss of death, to any kind of business. The way we turned that around is that I said I'm going to use this opportunity, and a lot of people did the same thing. Some people learned a new instrument, some people got a degree, and I thought that getting an executive MBA would be the next step for me to become a person who knows everything surrounding at least a little bit of everything, and hopefully perfect it over the upcoming years. But that's what needed to happen for me to be the leader that the business needed, and I wasn't necessarily that person before that. So that was a huge shift in mentality.
Yeah, wonderful. So, for any aspiring entrepreneurs, folks who want to do a startup, or maybe they're early in the process, what one piece of advice do you wish that you would have had when you were starting out that you want to share?
I think the biggest one is maybe a little cliche, specifically in medical devices, etc., which is like this is a marathon, right? So that one is you're signing up for a long term. It is not just consumer electronics and things like that. Consumer electronics, the timelines are a lot shorter. Um, the typical timeline of a medical device is 3 to 5 years, some of them 5 to 7 years. So when you set your expectations, you have to kind of tune them from the beginning that it's going to be a bumpy road. You need to make sure that you have the support from your family, and because there are going to be a lot of dark places and dark spots that you will find yourself, and you have to continue to shift and be able to come out of them. But don't burn everything, the first 2 years, let's say,
Yeah.
you know, really sit through it, and little by little give, I rather have a team, let's say, that is at 85, 90%, production all the time, rather than being at 100% all the time, and then, burn out, after a year or two.
You can't burn out. You got to have that. That's the personal capital that you invest to keep it going. So, last question that I have for you, Payman, which is looking ahead, what's next for Finally Quiet? And are there new industries or partnerships that you're looking at beyond dentistry to take
Yes.
your device?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. That's an excellent question. We're looking right now to get into surgical suites. That's something that we're very seriously looking at because, like for instance, if you enter like an orthopedic surgical suite, there are very loud noises, like for instance, saws or electric saws that are used for bone cutting and things like that. There are PA announcements on the ceiling of ORs that a lot of people can't hear, and it's an environment in which you could have also communication, but also access to AI and data from the patient's surgery right there real time, and the human interface, using audio is still the best interface, while you need your hands and you need your eyes to be able to operate on something. So you can imagine any kind of environment where things are very loud and voice needs to prevail. Finally, quite applies. So we're also talking to people in manufacturing and construction, Department of Defense, and sports also, because anything that you need to communicate real time and make very your rapid decisions or critical decisions, um, we see a market for Finally Quiet, and we're very excited to be here.
That is really exciting, Peman. Peman Montazemi, thank you so much for sharing your innovator's journey with us. All the best to you and Finally Quiet.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, the Greater Irvine Chamber. Thank you for having me. Bye.
All right, folks, thank you for joining us today, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you for joining us for the Greater Irvine Chamber Business Insights podcast. To stay informed about upcoming podcasts and other important business news, please subscribe to our channel or check the Greater Irvine Chamber website.